Perek Mem Zayin Pasuk Yud Dalid. What we're going to do now is revisit and continue the study of Yosef's management of the whole economy of Mitzrayim and the whole social order of Mitzrayim as part of his economic activities, reforms. What we're going to do is we're going to read, not inside, but we're going to be focusing on psukim Yud Dalid through Chof Hey. And why we biting off such a big chunk of psukim, because there's a lot of detail here in the negotiations and the ongoing planning, economic planning. There's a lot of detail about something which could have been one or two psukim, which itself points to the fact that points to something interesting. And what we're going to do is focus on some diukim. We're going to notice some details in this whole parsha, and I expect next time to maybe move on from Pasuk Chav Beis. So we're not going to focus on every single pasuk and every single word the same way we usually do. That's what I'm thinking, because we discussed this from two angles. Well, we discussed this twice, and now we're going to it a third time. So now we're going to try to cover it and be ready to move on to probably Pasuk Chav Beis, like I said. Okay, so Pasuk Yud Dalid. Vayelaket Yosef es kol hakesef hanimtzo be'eretz Mitzrayim ve'eretz Canaan b'sheva shehim sheverim vayove Yosef es hakesef beis Faroi vayitoim hakesef me'eretz Mitzrayim ve'eretz Canaan. Okay, first thing we notice, as we discussed in the previous year, is that Yosef cares and wants specifically the kesef. There's a great concern with kesef here, and it's only when the kesef is used up, as it says vayitoim hakesef. It's only when the kesef is finished that Yosef is willing to take something else. And not only that, but it's not even, the pasuk doesn't even say, that we spoke about last week, why is kesef so important? But you have to notice another thing. The pasuk does not say after the kesef was up, then he said, okay, let's move on to Mikna. After the kesef was completed, let's read then the pasuk this. So there's no silver. Okay, so now we have no way to buy food. Should we die? Yosef came up with this idea. Okay, if there's no kesef, give me mikne. So what I'm pointing out is that it's not that kesef is the preferred method of payment, and then they ran out of kesef and said, okay, let's pay mikne. They ran out of kesef, so they said it's time to die. They came to Yosef and said, what's the point of us dying? Or that would be a terrible thing. Why should we die? So he said, you know what? Yosef came up with this chap. There's no kesef, so I'll take mikne. So right away we have this question of, okay, it takes Yosef to come up with this. But the point is that this tells us that really it's all about the kesef. In other words, the fact that he wanted kesef and he went down to mikne is a big deal. He said, okay, it was kesef. Then he would decide, I'm going down to mikne. Now, okay, keep that in mind. And then, even that, we see further that even after he took the mikne, even after he goes down from kesef, and he's willing to take mikne, after the mikne runs out, there's like this crisis, as if they're guilty, right? Let's just read the psukim inside. He will get back to the pasuk in a moment. We won't deny to you. They're very apologetic. They're excusing themselves. Okay? So, in other words, what I'm bringing out is it's not that they paid kesef, but now, okay, you don't have kesef, I'll take something else. It's always like as if, really, if there's no kesef, there shouldn't be any deal. Yosef says, I'll take the mikne, and then they come back and say there's also our bodies and our Adama. Now, notice a difference. What happened here is that there's similarity, in other words, in the stages, right? The first stage is kesef, second stage is mikne, third stage is them and their land. the first stage is kesef, everyone's on board. The second stage is we're out of kesef, we're going to die. Yosef says, have a good idea, I'll take your mikneh. The third stage, they came and said, we're out of kesef and mikneh, we'll give you our bodies. Knei oisanu, pasuk yotes, lama nomos leinecha gam anachnu gam asinken osin balach v'nyanach v'nyanach v'nyanach. Okay, vayikin Yosef. So while first, when they ran out of kesef, it took Yosef to come up with this idea that they should give mikneh. When they ran out of mikneh, they were already offering. They come up with this idea. Let's do our Adama and our bodies. Okay. Now, another diak in pasuk Yud Zayin, it says vayinachalem balechem b'chol mikneihem b'shanahi. So first of all, this word vayinachalem, we find often the word vayinahalem to mean to lead something gently, and we also find it often in regards to cattle, mikneh, like Bayak Vasniya Nahalolit, Vagalatsoin, Vagalayilodim, and Olois Yinahel, and Amimunuchis Yinahaleni. So it's an interesting expression to use in this context. Notice as well, he just took their cattle, he just took their mikneh, is that associated? But it's an interesting expression to use when he's just giving out lechem, and why dafka in this place where he gives them lechem for their cattle to use vayinahalim. And does that have something to do with the fact that vayinahalim is a word used for mikneh? Okay. And there's another question here, because look at the pasuk. It says vayinahalim balechem b'chol mikneh b'shana ahi. That year he gave them lechem b'chol mikneh. The problem is that in that first year, they first gave him the kesef. When the kesef was used up, they went to mikneh. And then the second year they went to the bodies and their land. So the pasuk says that year he gave them, or he cared for them with bread in exchange for their mikneh in that year. But that year was in exchange for their kesef and then in exchange for their mikneh. So that's a question. Okay. Next. They said, pasuk Yotes, we read that. They said, why should we die, us and our land? So first of all, that's very interesting. Land dying. In the same pasuk we have, Ni anachnu va'admosenu avodam l'parei. They offered their lands to be slaves. It's another strange expression. So two expressions in this pasuk where the land is anthropomorphized, you could say, or it's treated as if it's a living thing that can be that can die or live and can be enslaved. Okay, that's interesting. And think about this also, the very fact that they're putting together themselves with the land is very significant. Meaning to say, okay, they gave up all their kesef, then they give their mikneh. You might think, then land, and then after you give up your land, give up your bodies. The fact that they're putting together their bodies and land, and as I mentioned, also talking about the land as if it's a human being who could live or die or could be a slave, so that may be they may be connected to the fact that they put their bodies and land together, as we shall see. But the fact that they're putting their bodies and land together is very important, because it's by virtue of the fact that they put their bodies and land together that there's a package deal, where in year 2, which may have been the last year of the Rav, however you count it, we didn't go into that, but point is this was the last transaction. The last transaction Yosef did with them involved bodies and land together. So it's very important that they're lumping it together. Otherwise, he would have probably purchased their land, because he already got their silver, he already got their cattle, now he could take their land, and then next year maybe he would have gotten them as slaves, but there was no next year because this was the end of the transaction. So it's important that they put together their land and their bodies, because that's why Yosef took those both at the same time and ended up becoming master of their bodies as avodim for Pari. Okay. All right. These are just a bunch of comments which we're going to... Right, so I mean, it points out, why did this happen, right? That's the question. Why are they putting themselves together with their bodies? Obviously, with the land and the bodies. Okay, next. Vayikin Yosef is called Admas b'tzayim lefar. Now notice they offered to sell themselves and their land. But here the pasuk says he bought all their land. Ki machru b'tzayim ish sadehu ki chazak aleim hara'av. So, right, that clause is very interesting, which, okay, I don't understand that. I'll have to say I didn't realize it till now. That the clause in the middle, ki machru b'tzayim ish sadehu ki chazak aleim hara'av, is completely superfluous. They already offered the previous pasuk that that he should purchase them and their land. So why is it giving a reason why he purchased their land? Because they sold it. He purchased it because they offered him to purchase it. Okay, question. But nonetheless, regardless, I mean not regardless because it may be very important, but reading this pasuk as a continuation, they said buy us and our land. Okay, he bought it. Okay, the land became Paris. Now what about the people? They also offered to sell themselves. Okay, so we have the next pasuk. Ve'es ha'am he'evir oisei le'arim. And the people, he moved it, the people, to cities. So this seems like this is how they were purchased, okay? Because they offered to sell themselves and their land. He bought their land. Did he buy them as well? Oh, well, it says one pasuk says something about the land, next pasuk says something about the people. So it seemed like the moving them around is how he made them his. And you think about that, there might be a very basic thing happening over here, which is like this. Imagine a whole nation says, okay, we're willing to sell us and our land to you. So what do? You write a deed. You and your land now belong to Pyro. It's nothing. In what sense does he establish ownership? There's a real problem here. You want to just say he owns it, but nothing has changed materially. There's no difference in the material conditions such that he should be the de facto owner. And if he's not the de facto owner, then the fact that there's a piece of paper that says he owns it probably won't have any effect on the actual behavior of the people, right? Because in other words, you buy something, you take ownership, take possession of it. When you're buying something so big, like a land and the people on it, and you're already the king, so what exactly is happening? So there has to be some shift, there has to be some movement. Even on a more basic level, he has to separate the people from their land. He has to move them off. It's very obvious he has to move them off his land in order to buy their land and to buy them. You can't just say, okay, look, I want to buy you and the land. Like, okay, sure, you own me and your land. And then everyone forgets about it. And 10 years later, he pulls out a piece of paper and everyone's like, well, we signed that once. Yeah, we did, but no one ever thought about it ever again. So there has to be some physical material change in order for this sale to be meaningful. And the physical change is separating them from their land. Makes the most sense. Plus, perhaps also dictating to them where to live. And some people read the pasuk, they're no longer living on their sadis, now they're living in the cities. So he's controlling them. Fine. But the problem is that later, they're so excited with his deal. In pasuk Chafei, they say, "Nimtza chen be'ini adoni v'hayinu avadim lepare." So now we have a problem. Here they already said, "Buy us as avadim lepare." So why is it repeated? Only after he comes back to them and says, "Hilachem zera," etc., and plant. Then they say, "Oh, you have kept us alive." Nimtza chen be'adoni over some avadim, but here they were already avadim. Okay, that's the problem. Okay, so first thing to understand is that it's very important. The punchline is that they said, in other words, the final word in this parsha is not Yosef twisting their arms until they forced to accept being avadim, but rather they're being so full of gratitude and saying, oh, you have kept us alive. If only we can find favor in your eyes, we want to be avadim. So it's almost like they started begging to be avadim. Got to the point where they wanted to be able to. I thought that was the best thing. That's very important. Okay. So now, okay, keep that in mind. What's one thing to keep in mind? So in other words, I'm saying one point, which I'm going to leave this point. One point is that, as I started off saying like this, he runs out of kesef, and then they're like, oh, why should we die? So he says, you know what? I'll take your mikna. Right away, the power gets shifted to Yosef, and it's non-transactional. It's as if he's doing them a favor. In other words, originally they walk and they say, you have grain, here's kesef. Okay, that's a fair, equal transaction, right? I have something of value, you have something of value. I have currency, you have goods. But then, if that would have continued, then they wouldn't have been excited to be avodim. What happened was, they're out of currency. They have nothing to purchase with. And Yosef doesn't say, okay, give me something else of value. Livestock is valuable. Land is valuable. Bodies are valuable. That would have been a transaction among equals. Instead, Yosef says, you're dead. You have no kesef. You're supposed to die. All he wants is kesef. He condescends and accepts, I'll take mikna. And they got the hang of it, and next time around they said, okay, they'll offer their land and their Adama. He doesn't even have to ask for it. But that's only because he already did them that favor one time. So Yosef is, by not immediately going for their mikneh, but rather saying, all I want is kesef, and then putting them in a position where they run out of kesef, and they say they have to offer their own mikneh. I mean, and they come and say, we don't want to die. He says, okay, I'll take mikneh. Right away, he becomes like as if he's doing a favor to them. And that's why the punchline is, like begging him, if only we find favor in your eyes, you have kept us alive. We want to be your slaves. So he shifted it from being transactional of, look, I have the grain, you have goods. And again, like I said, those goods are first silver, then it could have been currency, but he has the grain, and then you could have said, out of silver, give me your land, give me your cattle, give me your land, give me yourselves. That's all transactional, and then ultimately that means is that he, which is actually what he really did, he owned the thing of the greatest value, which is the grain in the years of hunger, and he utilized that to purchase everything of value, to make everything of value his. He didn't want that to happen. He wanted it to be that they were willingly, because Lamaisa, you have to keep these peoples in permanent serfdom, so he had to create a situation where they felt that, oh, you have, since you're the one that kept us alive with your great wisdom and foresight planning, so therefore it will be the greatest favor to us if you allow us to be your servants. So that's key to understanding this whole process, is that it's important that it end with them begging to please have the great honor of being slaves to power. Okay, that's one thing. Now let's go back to, I want to focus on one of the points, and I think it serves as a key to understanding some of the other issues. We noticed before that in Pasuk Zayin it says he vaynahaleim, he managed them, he led them, he cared for them with bread, through bread, for all their cattle on that year. So we noticed like this. We noticed, first of all, it's an interesting expression, by Nahalim. He distributed bread. By Nahalim usually means like caring, tending for. By Nahalim l'chol koshel, everyone who was stumbling, they helped them, they cared for them. So I think it means care. Like, so he cared for them with lechem. Why is it called he's caring for them? He's selling them lechem. Why is it called that he's caring for them? Because he sold them lechem for the mikneh. The other question we had was that it says he cared for them with lechem for their mikneh that year, but that same year they first gave kesef and then they gave mikneh. So why does it say he cared for them with mikneh if there was also a kesef component or part of the year was giving them lechem for kesef? So now, but remember, we mentioned as well that Ma'inahalem is a cattle word, an animal word. Does the fact that the pasuk uses a word that Yosef cared for them, like a raya, like a shepherd, raya, it's like Yosef, right? Yosef is like a shepherd. Does the fact that the pasuk uses shepherd word for them have any connection with the fact that they just gave him all their livestock? So I think it does. I think that's the point. And the point is like this. The point is that they come to Yosef and say, why should we die? What's Yosef's answer? What's Yosef's answer? It's an amazing thing. They came to him and said, let's notice this. They came to him, Pasuk Tezvav, and he said, they didn't say, we'll give you mikneh. They said, there's no kasef. Why should we die? Must mean, why should we die? It means, here's a human being. He could either live or die. And it's up to you, Yosef, because you control the grain. So all these people who can live or die all hinge on Yosef. And if you want us to live and not to die, then you should give us grain. And he says to them, you know what, give me your mikneh. He doesn't say, remarkable thing. In other words, on the one hand, he only wants kesef, right? So if there's no kesef, they expect to die. And they come to him and say, we don't want to die, or why should we die? And he doesn't say, you're right, you shouldn't die. He doesn't say that. He says, give me your mikneh. Now, give me your mikneh is essentially rejecting their claim to life on its own terms, because they said we shouldn't die. And he didn't say it's true you shouldn't die. He said you have something of value. What do you have of value? That you're a person? That you shouldn't die? That it's worth preserving your life? No. What you have of value is your mikneh. It's an amazing thing. If you look closely at the psukim, what happened was they came and said, we're human beings. We should stay alive. What's the point of us dying? And he's like, you know what? Actually, you do have something that I like. You have cattle. Okay? If you throw yourself at someone's mercy and say, don't you want me to live? Why should I die? Like, why should you see me die? And he's like, yeah, you know what? I don't want to see you die because you have cattle. What he's basically saying is you're worth your cattle. He basically reduced their worth to their cattle, because instead of accepting this argument that he, perhaps even in his position of Mishnah Lamelech Paroi, wants to preserve the lives of the Mitzrayim to as much as possible, he doesn't accept that argument. He doesn't care for them, but he does care for them as those who possess cattle, which means he's essentially reducing their worth to the cattle, because he's saying they only have value to him or to Mitzrayim in as much as they have cattle. So therefore, the reason why the Torah uses the word Vayinahalim specifically here, where he's giving them bread for cattle, is because by his insistence that I'm only going to give you bread because you have cattle, and otherwise you would die, basically. He's not saying I don't want you to die. He's saying, yes, you could die. I don't accept that argument, but you have cattle. So therefore, you're worth something to me, because like cattle are worth something. So therefore, when he takes care of them, he uses the word, a cattle word, because he's taking care of them in as much as they have, insofar as they have the value of cattle. Now, we asked that he also took money from them in that year, but the answer is that's not the point of the pasuk. The point of the pasuk is not just to recap that year's economy. The point of the pasuk is to say that once he shifted from kesef to mikne, then he also shifted to a nihol, and that year then became defined by nihol, meaning he was treating them like they are cattle, essentially. And then next year, and that's fits right into next year. Next year they were equating themselves with their land. Okay, because so now you see how it follows. The first thing that happened was that Yosef told them, "You guys are basically a bunch of cattle. I don't really care if you die, but I do care if you have cattle because that's valuable." So they became worthy of living only to the extent that they had cattle, which was worth something to the state. That's the way it is. I don't like it. I don't know what the implications of it are, but that's what the pasuk is saying. And that's why they became cattle-like. And now we get to year 2. Year 2, they say us and land. Now, and as we mentioned, they start talking about the land dying and the land being an eved. So I want to explain what that's about, but I want to first make a point. They said the only thing that's left in front of our master is our bodies and our lands. To me, there's something of value missing from here, and that is buildings. Right? If it's an inventory of what they can trade, why doesn't it say buildings? The answer is because buildings have nothing to do with agriculture. Money does, cattle does, farmers do, and land does. And the whole conversation here is about who controls the capital of agriculture. As we discussed in the previous year, there's a major irony here. Major irony, which irony is the reason why Yosef originally insisted on taking silver. The irony is that if he's going to demand from them their land and themselves in exchange for grain, then he's basically saying, grain, which is produced by you and your land, has to be paid for with you and your land. Doesn't make any sense, because then who is the king? Who's really the master? He's trying to become the master of the whole Mitzrayim. In order to master Mitzrayim, this is the genius here. In order to master something, you have to create a level of abstraction between you and the thing that you're mastering. And that's what Kesef functions as. That's what Kesef is so cool. Because Kesef creates a great distortion, because here you have value generated by the fields and by the people and by their cattle. The value is the grain, and he's giving them grain by taking the means of producing the value. It's something so absurd with that, because eventually it's like, wait a second, who's in control? Are you in control, or are those the worker in control? Who? And like that's a pasuk in Kehelas, Melech l'sod ne'evad. Pasuk in Kehelas, in this context, that ultimately is a tremendous irony, because the one who's really in control is the land. So how could you disabuse? How could you take people's land for giving them grain, which is what the land produces? The answer is don't talk to me practical stuff, tractors and farms. I want kesef. Because I created value by having some sort of a system, whatever, and all that kind of stuff. But then when you get closer and closer to the land itself, we have a little bit of a problem because you're ultimately recognizing the true where the worth land really inheres, which is why we said it ends with Yosef saying, "Hey lechem zar." Till now he's taking, havu, havu, and now it becomes instead he's giving him back because he's acknowledging that they have some power. Okay, why am I saying all this? Because so going back to the pasuk doesn't say when they said all that's left is our bodies and our land. They're not just saying all we have to pay with because maybe you can give buildings. They're not talking about currency here. They're saying if we're talking about reordering the whole value of the agricultural system, which is what this is all about, the only components that are left are us, the farmers, and our lands. Okay, now as we noted, they talk about the land dying, and they talk about the land being an effort, as if they and the land are, as if the land is human. Because the same way we had before that if their value is their mikne, they're not valuable as human beings that stand on their own. They're valuable as human beings that have mikne. Similarly, they're valuable to Yosef as human beings, not because, you want to just keep a human being alive. If you care about the Adama, now Adama needs Adamites, Adams to work it. Adam la'avodas Adama, and that's they they're the workers, right? So they were closely associated with their Adama, and they're so closely associated with Adama because the whole value is measured by their ability to work the Adama for the state. So therefore, they and the Adama are conflated, just like they're alive and they become Avadim. So do they start talking about the Adama as being alive and being Avadim? Okay, so that's why you see. So now the point of them being lumped together with the Adama and the Adama being treated as human follows from Vayina Halim Alechem, and it follows from this whole devaluing of them as, let's say we could say, independent human beings who have independent value or ends unto themselves, and becoming simply matters of utilitarian value, maybe you could say to the state, and that depends on their mikne and on their land. Okay. Now, when we had another question over here, which is how to understand, first of all, Pasuk of Aleph, the moving, why is that significant? And also, how do we understand when he purchased them for Avadim? Because on the one hand, in Pasuk Yutas, they offered themselves as Avadim, and then Pasuk Kaf says he took their land. You would think that Pasuk Kaf is talking about him taking them as Avadim, but nonetheless, later they say, okay, let's be Avadim. We wouldn't keep Avadim, sounds like they only became Avadim later. So I would say like this, here's the pshat. Remember we said, that's the pasuk in Keheles that says ultimately even the king is slave to the land. Okay, and as we explained before, the closer Yosef gets to recognizing that the value inheres in the land, the closer he is to exposing the absurdity of him taking power based on the fact that he has the grain and forcing the people to give their land for the grain, which is generated by their land. Basically, he's close to risking a revolution of the working class, I guess you could say, who recognizes that they're the ones who create the value. So what he has to do is like this, and because remember, ultimately the value comes from Adama. Ultimately, the king is a slave to the land, right? Now, if king is slave to the land, because ultimately the land is what produces everything, the whole Egypt, ultimately, even the grain that started in the 7 years of Sava is all because of the land. So if the king is slave to the land, okay, king is slave to land, not the end of the world, right? Because land is inanimate. But what if land and the people are identical? Because if you reduce the people to the value of the land, very interesting idea. If you reduce the people to some sort of, to being psychologically, whatever, looked at as some inanimate object, and inanimate objects have this brute force over even a king, then you, paradoxically, you actually are creating the conditions where the people might view themselves as being, and correctly view themselves as being the king, the real king. Because in as much as the land is the real king, and the king is actually a slave to the land, and these serfs are the part of the land, so they're the real king. You see the problem? So this is what happens. As you get closer and closer to the actual source of the value, and you devalued people as being free, basically. You said you're not free people, you're not agents, you're just the value of your mikna, you're just the value of your land. So they saw themselves so closely identified with their land. And the problem is that you're getting closer and closer to the bottom of things, which is the land. And you're recognizing who's controlled by whom. And the king is controlled by the land. And the land and the people are one. The land and the serf is one. So the serf is king. Big problem here. This is the problem. So here's what Yosef had to do. He moved them to cities. He delanded them. They came to Yosef and said, buy us and our land. He didn't say, sure, no problem, because there's a major problem with that. Buy us and our land means us and our land go together, or identical. Us and our land go together. He's like, you should know, I know it's right around the corner. What's right around the corner, see, 2 psukim later, is, as we said, he giving them something, because ultimately the bottom line, he recognizes that we are all in thrall, we are all enslaved, in servitude, in bondage to the land. So if they came to him and said, buy us on our land, because they so identify themselves with the land, he's like, okay, I'm buying you on your land, no problem. And then the next thing is he's going to admit the bondage to the land. Then basically they're becoming king, he's admitting bondage to them. So first thing he had to do before he's like, I don't know, we'll see about buying you. First thing you have to do is you have to separate them from their sadeh, from the land. That's why the pasuk makes one simple stress. That people, that am, which was before now was the am ha'aretz, was the am hasadis. Now he made them into an am. That am he moved to the arim. They're no longer a people that's closely identified with land and are working the land. They became city people. And by doing that, what he did was that even when they're going to ultimately go back to work the land, because we do need someone to work the land, they're not going to identify themselves with the land. So it's going to be like this. Look, it's an amazing psychology. We're eventually going to hit rock bottom, okay, no pun intended, but we're going to actually hit the land itself and recognize, that's where all power lies, okay. That's what's going to happen. That's where this is all, the story begins with land in Parshas Miketz, 7 years of plenty, and ends with land here. You got, ultimately the land is king. The land is king, then the landed people are king, like the serfs, the farmers. So what we need is like this. We need to make the farmers into city people. And then when it comes time to plant, okay, we're going to bust them out every day to the land. But they can't identify with the land because since we're coming around to recognizing the land has the power, if they identify with the land, which is why they offered themselves to be avodim, because it's one and the same thing. But the problem is that eventually it's going to turn around and recognize that the land is actually the one that has the power. And then you're giving the people the power, and then power is no longer a king. Yes, it's no longer a king. The people become kings. It's a revolution of the working class. Yeah, that's what's about to happen here. So what he has to do is he has to first separate the people from their land, so that when we come back to the capital, to the stock of capital, the land, which is actually the one that produces the goods, the people at this point are already dissociated from that, and they don't see themselves identified with the land. So that what? So then they come around and say, Nimtza chen be'eni adoni v'ina v'hafar. That's what he's going to say. So I was asking a question before. Didn't he make them avodim already? Why does it come back and say Nimtza chen be'eni adoni? The answer is like this. He didn't make them avodim. He made the conditions. He said he didn't accept their offer to buy us and our land package deal. Us and our land package deal is not a good idea because we're going to turn around and everyone's going to be busy with Helochem zeru zratem es hadoma. The land is l'maisa what we need. We need the land to produce. We're all in this together. We're all dependent on the land. If they are too closely associated with the land, which is what the impetus of their offer to buy them in the land was, that they were so closely associated with the land, then he's going to end up recognizing that he's an eved. He and Paro are actually an eved to the people. And in order for them to say, but avodim Paro, he needs them to not recognize that they are so closely associated with land. So he's like, okay, good idea. Let's see. He bought the land. Maybe that's the point of that pasuk. I asked before, how come pasuk Chaf it says because each person sold his land? He bought it because they offered it. The answer is they offered it as a package. He's like, listen, I hear a package. Let's see. Right now, you do need to sell the fields. Let's see. You guys, I'll move you off your land. So basically, he created a disconnect between them and the land. On the other hand, that offer was already put out there to buy Savanim, and they were so grateful that they said, no, let's do this. Again, to repeat myself, had he originally said, okay, yeah, I'm buying you and your land as avodim, then it would never have worked because the king, the Adam ultimately becomes king. the Adama doesn't become Avadim because they all have to go back to the Adama and make it work. So he had to separate them from the Adama in order to be able to reach the punchline, which is what they say, Nimtzachim be'en Adoni, for you know the Avadim lefaroi. Okay, so that's that. I think there's a lot of deep ideas here that are very interesting for psychology and economics. But so I'll just review them briefly, and I think next time we'll try to move on. Like I say, we'll start from the pasuk of the Adma Sakanim or something. But let me just review in brief what the conclusions are, because there's a lot of nitty gritty in the verses, in the psukim, in the words of the psukim. Okay, the conclusion is like this. The conclusion is that Yosef wants kesef. Okay, that's really what he wants. That we spoke about last week. Now, kesef is interesting because kesef is business. When you approach to someone with kesef, you're on equal terms. He has something that you want, you have kesef, good to go, fine. Once the kesef is, once there's no longer any kesef, so now in order to get him to part with his grain, you have to have something of value. Now, you have something of value, which is that you should be alive. But what if he doesn't value that? Then he has to tell you, well, what in you does he value? And Yosef tells him, I value something in you, which is your cattle, your livestock. Valuing them for their livestock is basically reducing them to the utility, let's say, of livestock. And lo and behold, the pasuk uses this expression of caring for them as one cares for livestock. Okay, and then they got the message, which is that the utility of these people is basically like serfs or slaves, and he doesn't really care for their lives. So, but he does care for them as the ones who have livestock. And then he also cares for them as the ones who are closely associated with the land. And indeed, they start talking about the land as if it's an extension of them, because he reduced their value to being the value of land. So the land is like a person. The land could die. The land can be an eved. Nonetheless, he doesn't then immediately say, okay, great, I have you where I want you, because he doesn't have them where he wants them. Why? Because if they're equivalent to the land, and ultimately the land is going to prove itself to be king, as the pasuk says in Kehelis, and this relating to this parasha as we discussed last week, that even the king is the slave to the land. So, because that's how this is all going to end, with us coming back to the land and recognizing that we're all dependent on the land. So if they are so closely associated with the land, and the land is king, then they are king. So Yosef has to say, look, I'll take your land, you have to sell that, fine. You guys, let's go move you to the cities. You're no longer going to be landed people because your land is mine, there's not work to do, whatever the reason is. So by that, he separated them from their land, so they're no longer identified by their capital stock of land. So even though eventually the land is going to become king, they are not going to recognize that they are king also. In fact, they're going to come around and say, you know what, we like it, we want to be avad, we like that idea we had, we didn't change our minds. Indeed, we want to be avad, and will be the greatest favorite to us. And this was the means whereby Yosef got the whole state of Mitzrayim to be Paris.